Hello, everybody, and welcome to YouTube Masterclass, Coursera, which just means it's a YouTube Masterclass that's connected with Coursera. And it's the great schools, California Institute of the Arts, University of Southern California, and Harvard.edu, because we're really an online course, we're remote. This is the next class of Masterclass, which is a new semester. Summer semester. I like the word summer school. But we're taking a 3-unit class. It's 12 classes long. It's on the Western. And before I get started, I just wanted to put away a few shop notes. One is we're behind schedule on when we had it out. But one thing about Masterclass is it's very flexible, only in the sense that you only really have to teach it once a week if you're teaching for a professorship, and this is for other professors already know that to join Masterclass, but you can kind of design the schedule in your own way. But I teach linearly, it's each class, you go through 13 classes, and I teach film. I graduated from UCLA with a film degree, and yesterday I found out some good news about schools, and I don't always apply to schools anymore, but I have like 10 PhDs, and it's really wild that I do, and I told you that before. But I have more than that, and I'm actually not really collecting them, but the school would like to offer me its services with one because I have scholarships still out there, and there's an idea though. And then one I just looked into is like Princeton, and it's like the 50 top best students in every field are just there filling it out. And I kind of talked to them about remote coursing and being in there, so I'm looking to see what they want to do to work with me, but that's not the problem. I have Harvard and USC and Calarts in one class, and really they're all very liberal schools. And it's all liberal education, and I don't want you as a student to get the point that we're just going to let you run rampant with some idea. And there are certain exceptions to that, and those exceptions throughout history, you can see why you would have that exception, but we really run a tight ship. And on your papers and things, don't tell the Coursera that you don't like someone because they're a different race than you. Don't do that. I gave you the wrong idea in Griffith because it sounded like I was saying it was okay in class if you did that, but if you said it, but if you write it down and you hand it in or you keep repeatedly say it, I'm going to call my liberal friends and be like, we need to reassess this test and have it thrown out, because you can't just angrily tell the professor that you don't get the question. And if you do, they're going to throw out the test and wonder why you didn't get the units for the test. You have to take the final seriously. Another note, though, that may not be anyone's fault is you have to watch these all the way through. And I know they get kind of boring because we're into technical details about movies and criticism and things like that and genres. So if you're taking the class, you have to see, and from one side to the other, the banner go all the way across. Then you can log it with Coursera. But the main thing is to get the credits, you have to pay Coursera, and then you get whatever credits you get. In the summer, it's 3, fall, spring, it's 4, with 16 classes apiece. All right, we can get started. That was just a little bit of laundry list I had to go through. It's pretty exciting to be back in Masterclass, and again, I apologize for being late. The days got ahead of me, and my projects kind of took a vacation for a minute, but I'm on the Western. Now, one thing we got to realize about genre is this big sweeping scope of narrative form that forms over the potential story's narrative over of a film. Now, a film has a story because it's like a book, left to right, or, as the projector runs through, each image that goes by is like reading an image. Although they could come down like this too. There's a lot of film that comes down, but even then, you're reading top to bottom. It's the order that you would read in, and suddenly you're reading these images. And that makes sense because persistence of vision is actually reading images. I can't come right now. So the persistence of vision is reading, and when you read a film, it's a text. And from beginning to end, it's like a book, and it has a start and a finish. as the film project does, probably because you eventually can't carry so much film stock in. Unless it's Apocalypse Now, then you've got to get a crane to carry the films in. But like the film cans in. But when they edit or when they film the film or anything, the film's always running like it's pages on a book flicking by. And letters are like pictures anyway, you know. Letters are like, they come from pictographs in English language, in any language almost. And it's that whole great thing we used to talk about, like folklore and mythology. Folklore being stories, tall tales, nationality explored. Of a nationality is like a country's, where usually besides America, or even America, it's like, it's their strength as a film, or their strength as a filmmaker to be from that country and represent it and what it means. So, if letters are like that's like folklore. And it's like a heroic character. And mythology is like the story that sends the folkloric character through the story. And letters are formed like that. I can't exactly explain how mathematics also has to do with letters being formed, but that's just how there's an order to the letters. And then you choose the word from, the parole and long, the long being like the straight across, and the parole being down. And suddenly you're like, in structuralism, you're seeing what word you're selecting here across, and then what word you're selecting down like this. And you select the parole down and the long across. And then you narrow it down to what the word is you want. And that's usually how you're looking for a word to fit into a book. But now, you write a book that's like 800 pages, you're going through it, it's like a monster. Sometimes the problems that you left in the book work better than the book. But it's still like reading it. But you can't just take a film stack and look at it and like it's reading. You can, but it goes a lot slower than a projector, and a projector puts it on the screen. And I think that's the whole point about cinema, is it has to be on a screen of some kind. Like, this is a screen here, when the reason why is because even in avant-garde films, the average characters always have a mind screen, or it's something they perceive. They look up and they're like, it's like a dream that is the reverse shot. So now we get to the beginning of film, and they're already, in France, they're already making industrial movies, and the first one is a train arriving at a station. No, it's not a Western, but if you look at it, it's like a lot of Westerns, like Quiet Man is not really a Western, but kind of is. But you look at Westerns, and there's always a train. The Iron Horse is about a train. I got that around here somewhere. We'll look at that movie. And I'm going to talk about Rio Grande in a minute to be the first film I suggest you watch for this. But we'll talk about that in a minute, because the train that's coming into a station has been used for a lot of American Westerns, that shot. And they've used it they remade it. They rebuilt that shot. And but if you kind of got to skip to like 1903, because 1895 to 1903, there's like, the only thing I could think of that would fill that gap is like Méliès or something. And the 1899 to 1911, it seems like A Trip to the Moon was like 1907 or 1906. And these dates are a little off. But the point is these are the early movies of the silent era. I've talked about them a little bit in film criticism, but none of those guys are really making realistic films, but they're all fantasy. And then you think in classical Hollywood cinema, when the sound era came, there was this whole idea that everything would be linear, like a book usually goes. Beginning to end. There's a beginning, middle, and end. Nothing is out of sequence. Nothing is drawing attention to itself, as though it's self-reflexive. The camera technique and editing is invisible. That is, the camera moves around and the audience doesn't even notice. Or they do, but they're just adjusted to that being the language of a shot. And you have this movie that comes along. Everybody's in Hollywood, even in the early days when Griffith founded it, and they were making Judith of Bethulia and all that in 1913. That's the first features were coming out, but they had a slew of short films before that. and I think it was in 1905 or 1904 that they released the first version of the Great Train Robbery. And that was really close to being considered the first film of the Western genre. But there are, as they've seen in discovering archive footage, there are other Westerns before that. One thing is, the Straight Shootin' is a famous one from the silent era, but it's 10 years after Great Train Robbery. So there's all kinds of silent era information that we're going to have to get throughout this class. But I'm kind of skipping around this time because I don't want to get too into one area and forget to cover another. I mean, honestly, we could really spend so much time in silent westerns. We could just make the whole thing silent westerns if we really had to try. Like, for instance, that Black Cyclone movie I finally discovered. It's the one where I didn't discover it like in terms of finding the film. The film was online, and it's got these horses, and they're like running around, and it's a movie with nothing but horses running around. And it's beautiful, and it's like they film it silent film, big crane shots, big down. It's like all the horses you've ever seen in a movie are all just flocking around in the Black Cyclone. And there's like a storm, and this amazing horse like runs through it. And they're stunt horses, but they're not hurting them. They had the Humane Society back then. But you could see how there was kind of this interest of frontierism, and frontierism comes from the notion that you're like a pioneer, or that you're conquering the frontier, or that you're camping out and seeing America's beauty. And the Western is typically American, but eventually we'll talk about foreign films and how they have Westerns in foreign countries. Like there's India with Sheley. There's other foreign Westerns too, like El Topo with Jodorowsky. And then there's Sergio Leone, who's kind of American, kind of Italian. Films it in Italy. Does he refilm it in America? Or does he film it both in Italy and America at the same time? And that'd be kind of hard to do because you'd have to keep flying back and forth. I always wonder if there's a secret like car under the world that only like filmmakers have. But I'm usually late myself. But the point is you get this sense of frontierism, and the frontierism is like this down home goodness. Like at the beginning of The Searchers, you see these guys sitting down to eat breakfast, and they're all good old boys, and they're all helping each other out. They're all, hey ma, thanks, and it's like the nice guys. And then the place gets ripped to shreds, and everybody gets killed, and they have to run off and go on this adventure to find the kidnapped girl. And then The Searchers, and we'll talk about it eventually. In film criticism, I covered a little bit of the Western, but the point is when you're reading an image and you see the language of the frontierism, like the frontierism being the place, the metaphor of the folklore and mythology. And the mythology of the Western is, of course, as Dr. Casper would say, civilization versus savagery. The conventions are sunsets at the end, running off into the sunset, cowboy hat, some like woman that's somehow in need of help, but she's very strong-willed herself, They live in the frontier, so they have to survive in the West. And it's around, the real story of the West is weird because it's from like 1820 or even earlier to about 1895 when they made Train Coming into the Station. Now listen, if the Old West closed with Buffalo Bill's show, and I gotta skip that real quick because we don't need to really discuss what that is. It's like him trying to spare Indians but still forcing them into theater, and they kind of do their own theater, and they're always getting in trouble because there's such like controversy over Buffalo Bill. The early silent era, coming from vaudeville, was where all the actors came, and there were a lot of stereotypes on vaudeville because it was like this. It was sometimes slapstick, fascist theater, because it was like, we forced you to work here, and you have to jump off this bridge and make it look funny. And that, like, a lot of the slapstick guys weren't really into that, but were still in slapstick. That's what's weird about it, because it seems like a low genre. but that Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and Charlie Chaplin are not a low genre. They just probably play it because they usually play like a middle class or a poor person, whether they're making fun of it or not. Now, I got a symptom here that they're totally making good satire, Chaplin and Keaton. So that's what excuses like the fact that they're kind of crass about the vaudeville crowd who are just like slam into a wall and that's funny. But it is funny anyway. We don't have to discuss comedy, although westerns are usually pretty humorless. Like you look at the westerns of Sam Peckinpah, and they're not exactly a laugh riot. You don't look at it and you're saying, well, this is suddenly something that cheers me up. Now, do we like dramatic cinema? And isn't the best cinema the serious stuff? So when you're reading frontierism, you're seeing these like pioneers, you're seeing these, and then the Native Americans, let me just put it this way, they're never shown good in the Western. Like, even when they're shown good, they're not shown good. And usually that's because they have Native American consultants on a set, and they're very good to the Native Americans they work with, but like in Hollywood films, not so much the early days of vaudeville, but Hollywood. And that's weird because they get paid. Well, some of them aren't even Native American, and they're like Latinos playing them, and that kind of thing is Django's, and we don't do that anymore in cinema. People are usually cast to their race, but I don't really look into that. What I'm looking into is that the Indians are treated fair on the set when you read the behind the scenes. But in the movie, it's civilization versus that ugly word, that I don't even want to say. So Native Americans, even, we'll talk about Little Big Man, and they're treated pretty good in that. But again, mostly this is like white directors telling us what to think about Native Americans. And so you're like, okay, but that's not what they think about them. They have friends in Hollywood that are Native American, so they would invite them to the set, and then they'd do stuntman work. But they're not showing like the legacy of the Native Americans. Like maybe Dances with Wolves gets close to that, but that's more of a sprawling epic type, Civil War film. It's kind of in a way has shades of Birth of a Nation because of but it's from the North and South perspective of the Civil War. The Civil War is going on right before the end of the frontier, and the Civil War getting closed down marked the end of the frontier, and that was just a few years after the Gettysburg Address was made. So then we're suddenly in the Mexican-American War, but that's never put on film in the silent era because all the cameras got destroyed. No, I don't know why. But that's ironic to think that there were cameras going to the Mexican-American War because that was 1899, and here we're in, that's like almost 120 years ago, And that's not that long. For an art form to have only been around for 120 years, there sure is so much that's come of reading these images, these texts. And when you take a look at the Native American treatment in the behind the scenes, you kind of get the hang of the idea of cowboys and Indians, although that's a very racist claim to claim that somehow that Native Americans were the enemy of cowboys. Because in the real pioneers' days, they were either, and all the way back to the conquistadors, they were either exploiting them for labor, killing them all, capturing them, or the rarity, living with them, teaching them school, and getting them out of, Fort Jensen so they can go somewhere they can be. But it's like, I never understood, if we're taking them around, why are we pushing them into another state? Why don't we give them the state back and walk our happy asses to the state we want to be in? Why are we like, you come to this state and fight with them? Okay. It's like some immature way of like getting rid of a race. It's like, we'll just move you to this state. Well, you can move your own happy ass. And I'm not trying to be mean, but like, why did they keep repositioning them if they already live there? Couldn't afford the corn maze that they cooked them at Thanksgiving? This is getting crazy. So the race, class, and gender to Westerns argument is kind of weak because it's saying that the Native, and you have to take a peek at that because it's like saying that I'm looking at this movie and I really like it and I don't even notice
that the Native Americans are the savages that are gunning people down, and they're gunning them down, and this is how we bring the frontier about, because it's filled with traps, like mythology. It's filled with thresholds, and one of those thresholds is these faceless Buffalo Bills, and usually there's something racist about every Western. But there's one thing I gotta say that doesn't ruin the genre for me. The reason why is because technically the Indians were actually stuntmen and were making pretty good money. They said they didn't think about the fact that they were degraded in certain books, like the book on John Ford by Lindsay Anderson says that the Native Americans were really the closest to John Ford on the set, and he would take care of them, and he would like. But that still sounds like this kind of commission for what other than else fetishism. Fetishism was where you have to show another race in a movie just to get the point across that either A, they're better than you, or you're better than them. I wish it was that way. That's not fetishism. A, you think you're better than them, so you put them in a movie to make them look like you're subservient. And I'm just going to leave it at that. We don't need to define it anymore, because it's like this idea is like, I love cowboy and Indian battles. And when we're kids, we all do with our toys. But then even the toy, the way it's mounted, goes back to this image of Buffalo Bill's show. And I don't want to talk about that too much, but you have to take into consideration the Westerns are still good intentions because the Native Americans were taken care of on the set. And if you think that's fetishism, maybe not, because not everyone was treated that good on the set, and some of them were movie stars. Okay. Now, so Great Train Robbery has the iconography, the train, the bandits, the dance hall sequence. And, the dance hall sequence eventually evolves into the dance hall from Gone with the Wind. And Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation are different kinds of films, but the closer to a Western is Birth of a Nation. And we talked about how it has lots of horseback riding. I know it's the Klan, but let's not talk about that too much. Only to say that it's a Western film in the sense of it's right when the Old West is ending. And that Griffith had made some Westerns, maybe not, because he made Civil war movies. And then mostly he would make a war movie. And we talked about that too, or a catastrophic event movie, like a big disaster movie. Like, it's like, not that, well, kind of like The Perfect Storm, or like some kind of like last minute apocalypse movie, And it's like, and I mention those movies only because, like Godzilla, there's a big disaster, and you look at Intolerance, and the whole city's blowing up, I mean, these disaster movies, and what's weird is even Fellini Satyricon seems like a disaster movie, because the whole time they're reading the story, there's an earthquake the whole time, and it's knocking over Rome. So it's like Fellini's causing the fall of Rome, and he's such a giant budgeted, he's beyond giant budget. Like, some directors get so big they're beyond giant budget. Like, they just show up and a hurricane happens and they film it. So anyway, we have to, and Edwin S. Porter was the one who did Great Train Robbery. So if Great Train Robbery was like a few minutes long, it was 12 minutes long, like the length of Un Chien Andalou was a few minutes more than that. And these are all early silent films. Un Chien Andalou is more like in 1929. So it's like 20 years later. So film is evolving. But as soon as it reaches the point of Great Train Robbery, now they're working on bigger silent films. And we'll come back. The one I want to get to today is Rio Grande. So we'll come back in a minute to, and a couple others if I can. We'll come back to the Iron Horse another day, because the second half of how they build Westerns is actually not Iron Horse, but straight shooting. And straight shooting is where you see Harry Carey in gun battles for like the whole movie, and it's cool. There's a Harry Carey museum near Valencia, California. And it's like it's Harry Carey is grabbing his arm, and the whole thing about John Wayne grabbing his arm and the searchers at the end. And so now so we'll get back to the silent era. I just wanted to mention Great Train Robbery and Straight Shooting and then Iron Horse. And, of course, The Covered Wagon, which is the iconographic Western end all say-all to what the Old West was like in terms of a stagecoach movie, because it's got hundreds of stagecoaches. And it's got real people crossing the land as frontiers. And they're all mixed religion, mixed race. They go across these big rivers. They go down through forests and everything, these big stagecoaches. Stagecoaches be falling over. The guy comes over the cliff and he's like driving down and he comes back up. And, you know, it's like this, it's a really bad conditions, but they have to get up rafts, you know. It's a beautiful film. It's like this, but it doesn't really have a central character that plays the role. And only in Westerns, Harry Carey was a star, you know, but Covered Wagon was earlier and it was about the same time and it didn't really have a star. It did, but you couldn't see them because they're all establishing shots. Like a silent film doesn't always have to have establishing a close-up like classical grammar, but it usually does, and that's a trait of Birth of the Nation, is start with the establishing shot and move in on the head shot and then kind of get like a bust shot and just keep mixing your shots around. So it seems like they're not changing camera positions when we're so used to watching movies that like we forget that they're changing camera positions and they're editing throughout the frame. It comes to an end and then they put the next frame of the next shot in and then they follow it for as long as the shot. 24 frames per second, usually in these films that we're talking about. So you kind of got the iconography of a stagecoach. And we'll talk about John Ford and more about him, but I want to start this off with the John Ford film. Now, I finally got to it, but in the 1940s, when World War II was coming to an end, John Ford, and I won't get into the whole thing about John Ford's war stories until later, because there's nothing really new about that information that I gave in film criticism. You might note that he was a fighter pilot in World War II, but he was also a really hard-nosed director. Like I said, the only people he treated good on the set was the Native Americans, and even then you gotta wonder, you know, because he's pushing them to do these stunts and making them look like Buffalo Bill. You know, and I'm not really ranting on that because actually that means that they were friends, kind of, if they were working together, but not necessarily. At least they were cordial enough to have him around in times that were kind of racially strifing. The reason that some of them started playing Native Americans that were them is because after the war, everybody was like, didn't I fight in the war with you? And then they realized that they were multiracial kind of society now because all these other races that lived in America fought for World War II. And so it's like around the end of it, John Ford's like, I'm going to make the Cavalry trilogy. And he just claims it. He had just got done claiming he only directs Westerns, which really, throughout his career, he's directed a lot of films that aren't Westerns, about as many films that aren't Westerns as are. You know, for every, like, Prisoner of Shark Island, there's Searchers, you know. And it's like, so, or it's like, most of his movies are Westerns, and this is how the Hollywood classical era defined genre. It usually was a director that made all kinds of films at the beginning of his career, like John Ford, and then picked a genre to go to. You know, like Hitchcock goes to suspense thriller, you know, Kubrick sci-fi horror comedy, you know. And his was a hybrid. And in the classical era, it's usually just one straight-up genre. And you can see as the genre develops that the reason it's called that word is it kind of emerges into a more complex thing as it goes. And that's why a lot of times the genre films that really sink home for me are even the newer ones, like the Tombstone and stuff. I like the older ones, but it's like you get towards an era like today, and there aren't as many Westerns, but the genre has been so developed that it can even merge with other genres. And it doesn't necessarily have to merge. you have to keep coming up with bigger and better ways to make a Western. So it gets very difficult because what you need is a cast full of strong actors, good actors. You know, John Wayne is strong, pretty good actor. You know, I like him as an actor because he's like a real. He seems real, whether he is or not. He seems real, but he's also too good to be true. You know, even though he's a bad guy in most of his movies, he is too good to be true. But the point is that like the Western needs a cast, a bunch of horses and shots of people riding horses, a bunch of gun battles and people having gun battles, and those are usually, but not always, with Native Americans. I'm trying to think of a Western where the Native Americans were actually good. How about Cheyenne Autumn by John Ford? Now, there's a sad film. I mean, it's about the Trail of Tears that I was kind of getting to earlier. And I won't go into the moral implications of that other than the Cheyenne Autumn shows the Native Americans losing their life, and it's a very sensitive film toward the Native Americans. Still, I feel they're a little, you know, stereotyped. And I'm just being honest with you because sometimes films date. Like you look at the Native Americans Dance with Wolves, it's not really Buffalo Bill anymore. It's more like this dance with the spirit of nature thing. And you're like, okay, I can see that as being more familiar. It still seems like the white savior though. And the white savior is where the fetishism comes in, and he's like, well, you Native Americans are all going to die, so I'm going to help you. You know, it's like, well, ain't you just here on time? And didn't that really cheer me down? You know, it's like suddenly he's the one that can lead them to grace because he's the only white one. And so I'm not saying it's a bad movie, but I'm saying it's just, why don't they make, you know what I like? I'll have to admit, of all the talk of race today that I've gotten into, and we'll discuss that more because this is a Harvard, Calarts, USC liberal class, you know, liberal film. It's film genre. And you know what is interesting is about like Apocalypto doesn't really, it has stereotypes a little bit, but it's pretty real, but it doesn't have the white savior in it. And that was so cool about it. You know, I thought the fact that they discovered the language was hard enough. And I don't know, I don't really care about Mel Gibson politically, but some of his movies are kind of like, well, it was okay, but some of his movies are like, whoosh, you know, that was a big movie. I can't believe he just pulled that off. And with Apocalypto, there's like these Mayans and the Aztec culture died before the Mayans, or vice versa, and they both came back and died before the other. That's confusing, but one of the guys has a home in this rock, and he's in this big tropical, well, not really tropical, but in a forest. In Apocalypto takes place kind of in Central America or like Latin America. It's further south too. It's not quite South America, but Latin America is between South America and it goes all the way up to Mexico. So and then Mexico goes up to Texas. And it's like, now I don't know if there's even any way to get through there, or if there ever was, but the point is that like in Apocalypto, the stereotypes are lessened because because Superman doesn't come to save the day. I mean, I like Superman movies, but if he flies over to save the Mayans, I'm a little concerned. So and that didn't happen, and I was like, weird. That was weird because like some people will say like, well, Mel Gibson made the movie, so he's the savior, but he's not, because he leads these people on their normal life, which does eventually come to doom because they have to sacrifice their souls to the god of the sun, and they have to climb the temple. It's not really. It's an Aztec temple, which were in all the villages, and then there's the ultimate one, and they take you sort of on this trip where he's running away, and it's like he's always running. It's like, and he's the Aztec guy, and he's being chased or the Mayan guy, and he's being chased. And the Mayan calendar was saying it was the end of time, so that was another cool thing about the movie. It's probably earlier plugged publicity, if you think about it. And so now he's running around, and he has his weapons like a spear or something, and it's not like one of those like yak, we're making a movie about like another culture and we're making it all fetishistic, like we came to film your island and make it all look exploitive. I mean, the violence and the action, you can tell they put a lot in it, but that they used the language, and that was verified to be the language, which in some other Mel Gibson movies, the language was kind of problematic about. It's Latin, but like you could see how the Mayan culture's language was actually programmed by an expert, and that the characters in the film really were from that race, because a lot of times in films, to get a racial character, you're picking someone else from the crowd and you're putting them in that role, but they're not the same race as the role you put them in. And that just has been going on since vaudeville. And even before that, like with theater, it's like Shakespeare only casting men, even for the women's parts. It's like, if that changes, then here we go. So in Apocalypto, the point is like, even when the conquistadors are looking like, I don't know, like Che Guevara on a frickin' jet ski or something. No, I'm kidding. I don't know, but it's like, what was that? It was like this giant ship of like these conquistadors was coming, and that's beautiful. I love how he films it. I love how there's no like really redeeming factor to it, except that they were living their life as they normally do, which they normally get killed in temples and get chased around by ships and other members of their village. And I'm like, that's problematic, because if you're doing that on a regular basis, it's like, how do you keep finding a new family as they're all being chased off, as you all get chased and scattered? But it's a cultural thing that they were believing in the worship of the sun, and the sun god plans everything, and you can't defy the meaning of the sun god. So by the conquistadors coming in, they still believe in the sun god, and they may even merge with the sun god. But by the time they're gone or whatever, who knows? Maybe they became part of the sun, like they believed, and maybe that was why the world didn't end in 2012. But I just had to get through that. Now there's more I have to talk about Rio Grande. Rio Grande is it's a frontier movie, but I mean it's old west movie. It's part of the Cavalry trilogy. So the cavalry is used to show reconnaissance in the U.S. of World War II. Now, reconnaissance means what's left of us is more than them because we won the war, but now we got to go back to the battlefield and find all the living people and all of that. So after the Civil War, there was reconnaissance, and Rio Grande. Now you got to remember that this is 100 years almost after the Civil War that Rio Grande came out. But when World War II ended, there was reconnaissance. And in this movie, which is set right after Civil War, is matching the World War II ending about reconnaissance. That's what cavalry's all about. All the natives have killed everyone, supposedly. And they're all trapped in a fort. This could be true. I don't know. It doesn't make them look like the victorious ones, really. But they have these forts throughout. There's Fort Lewis, there's Fort Sumter. A lot of these forts were built West Point, where they're on these cavalry stays in West Point. And it's like, if they all follow cavalry movies, those three, Rio Grande, Fort Apache, and Chihuahua Ribbon, which we will talk about all those, is not really convincing to me that they're really, the war's never going to end, is what World War actually means. Because World War doesn't really mean the whole world is at war. It's what Hegel said is that the war never ends, ever, in history. Like, it's been going on forever. It'll never die. Peaceniks like you and I will die, but the war will never die. But there's like this whole thing where the civil unrest has created these forts to keep the locals of the forts safe, and the natives that are on their side, which I can't understand how you'd want to do that, because that'd be kind of like looked at today as a sellout. Not really, though, because these are shaped narratives on iconography, so you can be a little easy on the stereotypical thing. It's a horrible thing to do, but the Indian was having a good time. It's like when Ricardo Montalban is in The Searchers or whatever, And that wasn't even who it was. That was like Ben Navarro. Sorry. But there's like so much I see that in a Western that's kind of, even Heaven's Gate later with the sheep herders is kind of, it's not that it's overblown. I don't think it's overblown because that's like kind of an insult saying that it went too far. I think it's one of the biggest movies I've ever seen, but some of them, they don't see, some of the characters seem a little like the class teaching in it isn't too bad, except for it's kind of seeming the characters are perfect and they're like modern actors, like Chris Christopherson's in it, uh, and Christopher Walken, and Heaven's Gate isn't too bad of a movie. They actually recovered some of the money they lost on the Criterion Collection. I thought, well, Heaven's Gate does seem almost like non-stereotypical as it goes. So that just means that they seem to, like, as the genre developed, it seems like the characters have become more complex. Like by the time Clint Eastwood reaches it, you have this complex, modern, like existential character that isn't going to leave you without surprises because he never gives away. He's got a poker face. I mean, Clint Eastwood's got the poker face. He'll look right at you and you'll think you know what he's thinking, but only he knows what he's thinking. In the movie, I'm not saying in real life. In real life, everybody wants to be him. But like in his case, he's the modern hero of the Western premise. And that is the frontierism and versus the harsh conditions of the small town and a fistful of dollars in the spaghetti western by Sergio Leone. He becomes this modern sort of protector of virtues of everyone that's fallen. And he doesn't even want to be that because all he wants to do is make money and kind of fake people out and like scam people. And then next thing you know, he's like this altruist vigilante type that's saving this village just because he stumbled upon it to go have dinner there or something because he needed some dinner. So now he's saving the whole village. He becomes like this big time, bounty hunter, and the whole movie, it gets more and more interesting as it goes on. But in Rio, and we'll talk about the Man with No Name trilogy in a couple of lectures. But the Cavalry trilogy, with all of them, are at West Point, and everybody's friendly because they're home. It seems like the base is well protected because they got those giant like log things you see kids building their Old West toys with. And there are Old West toys. And I'm not really offended. I'm offended in one way at the racial stereotypes, but not really because it's dated. It's from about 60 years ago, and that doesn't seem too long. But the civil rights movement came a long way in Vietnam. So actually, you could see that the Sam Peckinpah level of the Western is a lot more complex, like with Clint Eastwood, and that's where I don't really mind the race relations because everybody, even on Once Upon a Time in the West, has these characteristics of complexity and ambiguity, and we like them, but they're bad guys, and like Charles Bronson, But I didn't really. I like the Cavalry trilogy. It's one of my favorite trilogies. It's some of my favorite movies. This used to be a favorite of mine. Because despite all the things we talked about, when they're in there, they show, in this one, it's the happy side. Like they're all showing the training. And it's got these guys that jump from horse to horse that are racing along. Now, if they're jumping horse to horse, it's stuntmen. And stuntmen were doing all the work for the director John Ford, and stuntmen were always jumping off of stagecoaches. And in this movie, there's a lot of great stunts. This one is probably John Ford's best stunt movie just because there's a whole section where they're training to do stunts at West Point, and John Ford's son is training to jump from horse to horse, and the women in it like fawn all over the soldiers. It's kind of like the women in the movies are given a good role, but they're kind of like Susie Homemaker types in these westerns, and that not always true because if you look at Stagecoach or anything by Peckinpah, On Eastwood, it's like the women characters are complex, but Stagecoach is interesting because Claire Trevor is a lady of the night. That even sounds offensive. I don't want to say it that way, but she's prisoner from this guy who gets money from her. And you can't really see this unless you watch Stagecoach like more than once. You can, but like today's standard, that one's not too dated. It is in a way because there's ways that you could remake it with like country stars. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not bagging on it because it's a simple western. But the lady in it wants to be with John Wayne because he broke out of jail and he's keeping her safe now. And they found him on the road, and she was joining the Stagecoach there. So it's like the relationship isn't too bad. But Rio Grande is kind of reinforcing this nuclear family idea. Like we're all at home. That's how we keep safe. That's how outsiders don't come in. We have big fences to keep people out, and we all watch the radio, listen to the radio, and watch TV. And someday Rio Grande will be on TV, they're thinking, in the 1940s. But that's actually the beginning of TV, isn't really, of TV spreading all over America, is more like later 50s, or like earlier 50s. So all these new ideas are coming out, and John Ford's directing it like kind of like Quiet Man in these cavalry movies, where it's not as much of a Western as it is a kind of melodrama about like kind of a costume drama. Like everybody from that time is like this kind of laid back, because you got to realize this is way after 100 years after the Civil War, this movie, and they're showing 100 like right at the end of the Civil War. So the natives in the movie are at least expressive of the idea that they were probably there at the time, that the arrangement of actual living is never like the arrangement of the actual film, even though we use the memory of the film to seem that it is the time of the movie set in. And that's more a suspension of disbelief. That's more of that reading forward. And it's like, of the film moving through, even on a digital timeline, it's like that they transfer these films to. It's like you're reading across the strip. And I didn't really think that it was too bad to show the nuclear family view, because he's kind of breaking it apart and saying, but there's still danger. And we've got to train up for it. But we're going to have fun training up for it. But we're going to drink lots of whiskey for it. And personally, I don't drink, but I talk about it in music and things. And the reason why is because in John Ford movies, there's sometimes smoking. Like John Wayne will smoke. And I think they edited those scenes out of some versions. But he takes, like in Stagecoach, he'll take a cigarette, or Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and light it with a lantern. And John Wayne's in Rio Grande. John Wayne's early career was like interesting because in the early days of his career, he was kind of not really used to Westerns, but he tried Three Bad Men out for his first movie. That's John Ford. John Ford said, in 20 years, I'll put you as the lead actor in Stagecoach. And after Iron Horse, and then they hit Doldrums. But like John Ford still made The Informer and Prisoner of Shark Island at that time in his non-Westerns. So you fast forward from like Drums Along the Mohawk, Stagecoach, you're gone all the way, and Drums Along the Mohawk's in color. It's 1938, 1939. And it's like a colored Western with Henry Fonda. So now you're fast forwarding, and it's a really good, and you fast forward to John Ford's, all his films are good. But the struggle is that he does not really do it just for the cinema, but it's mainly for the genre. But he comes back to the Western with Stagecoach, and we wind up My Darling Clementine in Rio Grande. And I'll talk more about the Cavalry Trilogy, but what the main thing is if it's the nuclear family, and they're all together, and they're all in one little safe place, then how do they get from here to there? Well, they send shuttles and couriers, and it's this big, vast wasteland between them. How did civilians end up in forts being protected? Who destroyed everything? Was it the Civil War? And how far did it go? These are history lessons we don't always get. How far from the North and the South, the Confederate States and the Union, how far to the left of the map of the U.S. from there did the Civil War ravage? Was the Civil War going on in states south and north of each other throughout America? And the real answer is yes and no. Mainly, these areas were for Native Americans, and there were politics about the different types of Native Americans, and like Cherokee and Pawnee and all these things. They would list these names that were kind of inaccurate about what the Indian's name really was, and it would kind of stick, just like when they found Indians when they were in America, the Christopher Columbus, and they were really Native Americans, but they thought they were in India. You know, they got lost on the ship. So I'll close today's lecture really quick, but I just got to say, what's really interesting is our fear of the outsider is so paranoid that there is actually an element of paranoia about this film. Like they're constantly looking over their shoulder to see if somebody's breaking into the base, like an outlaw, an Indian. You know, it's like they don't let anybody in after a certain time, and they close the gate. You know, and I'm like, well, it's John Ford is cool because he's commenting on these things as well as informing them as stereotypes. He doesn't really like the word art, but he doesn't really veer away from like the complex idea that like we could put everybody in this costume drama and everybody kind of gets a blow in the movie, but it's these techniques to use the icons of the Old West, you know, like what we call those, that era before the Civil War to about 1820. And that whole era wasn't really all about rounding up Native Americans and killing them, but they had gone to that point because they're stuck in these forts. That history is quite inaccurate. That there was more paranoia than that is because there were other wars, the Mexican American War, which isn't really mentioned. But the point is like in Rio Grande and everything, he kind of comments on it by tricking everybody to do it. And in a weird way, I know it seems like he's not doing this, he's using the stereotypes as kind of these Kubrickian models. And nobody would agree with me except for he was in World War II and he had already been to Europe. And when you're in Europe, you don't really have the notion that people of other races are necessarily bad or good. But there's places that do that anyway, because America is not the only racist country, but some countries are less racist or barely racist at all. And I'm not going to get into that because we get into a big argument. But totally, we can see as the Western opens with its iconography, you can use, like Great Train Robbery, you can use exaggerations and expressionism in Rio Grande to illustrate the romantic genre of expressionism extended to kind of this greater height, which is you can use the costumes and drama of and editing and everything to show the iconography, but the iconography in a movie is moving, so it seems exaggerated when it may not even be as huge as the Old West really was. And the Old West was so big that I don't even think it was called the Old West back then. It was like Arizona Territory, Colorado Territory. No, those were Old Westerns from a little while after Rio Grande by Jacques Tourneur. And it's like, well, okay, so if you're saying that the Western is like after the Civil War and we're putting these movies after World War II to like design the West when the other war ended and vice versa, then we're commenting on the iconography rather than just showing it as a cardboard cutout. And the Harry ones even have complexity, and the whole history of the Western has complexity because there's even because of the Buffalo Bill style kind of redeemed. The only redemption of that is later it would become a stick figure for what you're doing in like almost a zero for conduct way that these guys are stopped and they're just looking, and that's the whole Kubrick thing, like in Barry Lyndon, when the frame freezes but something's still moving. So it's like this Fort Apache in Rio Grande are like these unmovable sources that are protecting the flag, you know, protecting the Grail. I've explained it. And it's like the Grail ends up being kind of a comedy of itself, and all they do is train, get paranoid, not get in the gate past a certain hour. This shows Native Americans on the cover, but I know Rio Grande has a couple of battles, but the movie is not really obsessed with any of that. But if there's any kind of stereotype by the time of John Ford, it's him being slightly tongue-in-cheek because he saw it all in World War II, and now we're all still scared that everyone's going to come invade us. And that's called xenophobia. And John Ford loved commenting on xenophobia to the point that he mixed up the searchers. So thank you for taking my first lecture of class, and we'll talk to you again next week probably. I've got a little work, but I won't be as long. Hopefully we won't get tied over, but we'll have, 11 more lectures, so hang in there and see if you can get through your notes and look at your schedule. And I don't know, that's the one downfall of this class, is you never know what day of the week it's going to fall on, depending on how busy or things pick up around work. So this is work too, and I take it very seriously. Thank you. I'm Dr. Aaron Sheedy. We'll talk to you next time.